Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you've got a sunny day going wherever you are. I have one where I am. This is Susan Holson. I'm the Director of Education Services for VSBA, and I'm joined today by Sue Siglowski, our Executive Director.
Good afternoon. Nice to see everyone.
And Sandra Cameron, our Director of Public Policy.
Hello, everyone. Welcome.
And Carrie Lamb, our Director of Operations.
Hi, everyone.
So what makes a meeting effective? And there are a bunch of components, and these are the ones we're going to really focus on today. A well-organized agenda is critical because it focuses the discussion and the decision-making. Effective facilitation by the chair so that people are comfortable to speak, but stay on topic and remain constructive. Board members who come to meetings prepared and have thought through the decision items on the agenda and also the discussion items and are prepared to have those conversations and also ask relevant questions when the discussions are happening at the meeting level. And finally, a comprehensive recording of the proceedings, namely the minutes. Now, of course, while we're meeting virtually, part of the modification to open meeting law is that all virtual meetings need to be recorded as well. So let's talk about the agenda first. The board chair is really responsible for creating the agenda, but works very closely with the administration, usually the superintendent. I have heard many boards tell me, oh, the superintendent prepares our agenda. And that is a compact between the chair and the superintendent to figure out where the division of labor is there. But by and large, the agenda should really streamline itself aligned with the board's goals for the year. So you want to make sure as chair, you want to make sure it's everything that's on the agenda is really relevant for the board. We recommend timed agendas. So you set an amount of time for each item that's on the agenda. And that way you keep the meeting at the reasonable amount of time that you have scheduled. I have heard countless people complain about how your board meetings go for 4 and 5 hours. There's just no reason that they need to be that long. And we'll talk about some of the issues that may spring up that cause them to go on that long and other ways to deal with them effectively. Where do items belong on the agenda? Well, we recommend, and we'll be passing around a sample agenda, that you put the important items on top. That means items that require board discussion, action items that are complicated, and of course you've discussed them before, but it's time to take action. Things, you know, our meetings are in the evenings and people are tired. And so waiting until the end of the meeting, whatever time that may be, 8 or 9 or 10 o'clock, to take up reports to the board on progress in the district is really counterproductive. So you want to get those in earlier and end your agenda with the routine items, you know, the standard reports, your consent agenda, and those kinds of things that don't require as much thinking and engagement of board members. And how do you decide what's on an agenda? Well, first you have to ask, why is it here? Is this something that we need to talk about, act on, learn about? Is it an information item? Why do we need to include it? And what is the expectation of the board on this item? What information does the board need to act? Make sure your board members are prepared when they come to the meeting, that they have all of the background that they need to be able to be smart about the discussion. Is this something that needs immediate action? Is it something that needs to be enacted in this fiscal year? Make sure that you have a sense of urgency, and also outline what, or at least understand what the implications are for the students and or the community and or the budget. Those are the things that the board needs to really keep an eye on. Types of agenda items, they're discussion items. These are things that don't require any action, but it's an opportunity for board members to share their opinions and their analysis of issues that have been identified for discussion. Action items need a vote. That vote needs to be covered very carefully in the minutes, including the name of the board member who made the motion and who seconded it. And if there's a split outcome, also the count on the outcome. Consent agenda items are really, a consent agenda is really designed to be a time saver, right? So you can group things into a single agenda item like meeting minutes and from past meetings, that is. And if there's a warrant that's already been vetted, to approve a bulk of actions that are really quite routine and can be reviewed by board members ahead of time so that nobody's put on the spot and has to take action on something they haven't prepared for. And then there are information items, and this is where the superintendent may advise you of some upcoming changes, actions. This is where any updates on the school opening in light of the current pandemic situation, things that are changing, would fall under information items. So we'll take a minute here and let me just stop and see if there are questions about agendas or the agenda process or following an agenda. Carrie, I believe we had a question. Yeah.
We do, and we also have some from the audience.
Excellent.
I'll give you the one that was sent in to us first. It says, do boards outline what each agenda item covers?
I'm not exactly sure the extent of description that is being referenced here. I think it's important that everybody who will be seeing the agenda, that's all board members and any members of the public who may be interested, needs to have enough of an understanding of what the issue is so that they can be prepared, the board members can be prepared to discuss it. And if members of the public have comments that they know that they'll be relevant. But I do not believe a really detailed explanation of each agenda item is necessary. Sue, do you want to respond to that in any other way?
The only thing I would add is that it needs to be detailed enough that people understand what the topic is and what type of, the decision that the board may be making on that topic. So it can't be too general that someone would still be, not understanding what the board would be addressing on that agenda item.
Great, thank you.
Okay, we have some questions from the current audience. We're told to shy away from timed agendas because we're responsible to adhere to that time. Is that accurate?
Well, yeah, you're responsible to adhere to that time, which is why I was recommending them, because it will keep you focused and keep the meeting moving and make sure that you get to cover all of the items that are on the agenda.
Okay, the next question. Is it necessary to break out the discussion and action items for a budget? There has been confusion on our board where we have an item on the agenda to discuss, but then the discussion turns to a needed vote, and folks think that's not permissible.
Sue, could I defer
Want me
to you? Yeah.
Sure. So it is best practice to not to vote on an item that it's not clear that you're going to be voting on it. And so typically what boards will do is on those type of items that it'll be on their agenda first as a discussion item, and then at the next meeting as a item to vote on. So I'm not sure if that exactly answers this question, but it sounds like the situation that's being described has taken some board members maybe by surprise, and that should be discouraged, I think, and hopefully would be if the if there was enough planning in advance.
Right, so if a board member couldn't attend a meeting but they saw there was that they weren't voting on an item, then they would be upset to find out that they actually voted on a discussion item. And that brings the next question. Does any item that will be voted upon have to be on the agenda, or can it be brought up during the meeting on the fly, say during a discussion? And that goes to the same type of answer, correct?
Yeah, I mean, it comes to best practices. There may be situations that are, you know, their boards can meet on an emergency basis, and so there may be situations where they have a regular meeting already scheduled and something comes up that they need to address on an emergency basis, and that's not disallowed. It's just not what you would want to be using as your regular practice.
I'm also
Okay.
just thinking about some of the process that's happened in the VSBA board meetings, Sue, where we had intended a discussion and a board member had proposed a motion coming out of that for either an action or a position for the VSBA to take, and those were not necessarily anticipated actions, but came from the discussion.
Right, that is sort of a separate discussion, I think, from a school board meeting.
Okay, thank you. Terry, were there more questions?
There are more. What is a
Okay.
reasonable time for a weekend meeting or weeknight meeting to start? We start at 5:30, and I'm a little concerned that this is too early for people who work 9 to 5, but don't want to start too late because then we'll finish too late.
Yeah.
I'm
It
sorry.
really depends on your community and your board. The boards, I would say anecdotally, start times are anywhere from 5 until 7 and can run, you know, from an hour and a half to, I don't even want to guess how long some meetings go. We've heard some nightmarish stories of meetings going until 1 a.m. So I think it is a delicate balance, and the different boards accommodate that different ways. So they may put a public comment session in at the end of a meeting to accommodate people who couldn't be there for the beginning, for example. I would say probably
Okay.
6 o'clock is probably the most common start time.
Okay, so as I read through the next couple of questions, if any of them are going to be covered later on, just let me know and I'll hold on to the question.
Okay.
Is the proper way to add agenda items for a meeting to ask at the end of a meeting or email the board chair? I email the board as I've asked at the end of a meeting and items are not added.
Is this a board member is asking a question
Yes,
about adding a future agenda item?
that's
Well,
correct.
okay, thank you. To some extent, it is the chair's discretion as to whether an item should be added to the agenda. So if the item in question is something that the chair and or administration doesn't feel is going to advance the board's work and or isn't really encompassed in the board's work, they may make the executive decision, if you will, not to incorporate that as an agenda item.
Susan, I have a follow-up question to that.
Sure.
If the board, if the board member brings it to the board and the board votes to have it on the agenda, does that overrule the board chair?
I don't know the technical answer to that. Sue, do you have? I mean, I would think it would.
Yes, I would think that would mean that the item would be put on the agenda, the next agenda. The board had voted on it.
Okay, next question. How much time should we allow for public comment?
You're not going to like my answer. It depends. if you know that you are taking on a heated topic and you anticipate that there will be a lot of members of the public who are eager to speak to a topic, you're going to want to leave more time because you do want to make sure that voices are heard. At the same time, that can really disrupt a meeting. And so I'm thinking of a meeting that I attended once where one of the agenda items was discussion, not an action item, but discussion on whether or not to close a high school. And obviously the room was packed. And it would have, I thought it would have been very difficult to actually hear from all of the people in the room and also conduct the rest of the board's business in a reasonable amount of time. And so when there's something that is known to be of that much interest among the public, I would advise scheduling a forum, a public forum, and making that the sole agenda item and have an opportunity to let people talk and hear what they have to say, and maybe even to organize that discussion so that people know that their voices are being heard. Generally speaking, you know, you have 2 or 3 people who have a comment about something that may or may not be on tonight's agenda. So it's not really a consideration.
I'll just add as well that the open meeting law does require that the public must be given a reasonable opportunity to express its opinion on matters considered by the public body, which the board is a public body, during the meeting, as long as order is maintained. And it also, open meeting law also provides that public comment shall be subject to reasonable rules established by the chairperson. So the chair can establish, you know, how much time each person is allowed to speak. They would want to make sure to have that be evenly applied to everyone who speaks, and make sure that someone is keeping track of that time as well.
And we will be talking more about open meeting law and public comment as we go on this afternoon.
Okay, next question. How much time should be spent on principal or superintendent incidental reports?
I'm going to give you my own personal opinion because I don't think there's really any guidance on this. I would say none. I mean, if that's in the board packet, it's there for you to read. It's there for your information. So unless there is anything outstanding about it, there's really no reason to take that up at a board meeting.
Okay, the next is kind of a statement. It says your agenda didn't include time for public comment unless I missed it.
I haven't really provided an agenda. I'm not sure what the question is referring to. Oh, the types of agenda items, perhaps? Yes, public comment is, of course, an agenda item that needs to be included. Thank you.
So is it best practice to list a vote item, but if you do not, is it legal according to open meeting law to allow a vote on the fly? Sounds like they're saying if the vote is, if the agenda doesn't include it as a vote, can they still vote? And I think we already answered that.
Yes, I think we did answer that. I could certainly provide a follow-up when we send out the information from the meeting.
Okay, the next question. We have had that experience where we moved meetings to earlier or later because people said they could better attend, and then those people seldom ever showed up. This is probably regarding the start time.
Right.
The next one just said board chair, so I don't know what that means. The next one says, how would you vote on something without a board chair opening the floor for motions?
I don't believe you can.
Well,
So
but
you can
someone,
call,
presumably one of the members would make a motion.
yes. So they don't have to call for motions, correct? That
Okay,
you can make a
right.
motion from the floor without the chair saying I'm calling for a motion.
Correct.
All right.
Right, but you can't vote on anything without a motion.
Right, but someone in the, one of the other board members can just make a motion.
Right.
And we say, as far as public comment, I've attended meetings as a board member and had a senior board member attempt to deny public comment on an item by asking for a motion to either vote or come to the next agenda item. So they called a motion. How is a board member to address that member's actions? So they cut off public comment, it sounds like?
It sounds to me like this board was taking public comment as it went through its meeting. The best practice for public comment would be to take it either at the beginning or the end of the meeting or both, and not throughout the meeting. So I think that maybe is playing into this question, because I wouldn't see this scenario necessarily happening if you were doing public comment at the beginning or the end of the meeting.
I think we've reached the end of the questions, believe it or not.
Okay, excellent. Well, we had a feeling we were going to have a lot of questions today, and that's great, because that tells us that we're addressing the issues that people have concerns about. Okay, so we now have an agenda. It's meeting time. How do we make sure that that meeting runs effectively? Well, the first thing and is just to start on time. If the meeting is called for 6 o'clock, if you have a quorum at 6 o'clock, if you're the board chair, you start that meeting. If people are late and they are texting you, or you know that they're coming, they'll get there, but they should know that you're going to start on time. Your public should know that you're going to start on time. It's just a signal that you're doing your job. It's also on the chair to make sure that order and decorum are maintained throughout the meeting, but it's really on every board member. You know, we're all neighbors, and respect for one another, even differing views, is really important in the context of a school board meeting. And so don't get derailed and don't go into the rabbit hole. Stay on the topic at hand, stay on the agenda items, and always, always, always keep those in relation to your district goals. And that way you're going to maintain a streamlined meeting that will keep you moving forward and not having to take a step back. VSBA does have a sample of effective board protocols, which we'll be sending out with the follow-up to this meeting. Board protocols just sort of outline the rules or the guidance that the board uses to conduct its business. You see, I mentioned treat fellow board members with respect. I guess that's important to me. But if everybody has the same understanding and expectation of how the board works, then you won't have the hiccups of having disgruntled board members because they had a different expectation. And one of the things that I know board members struggle with is this whole idea of the board as a legal body, as a public entity, has a single voice. And so one of the protocols that we recommend is that at your annual reorganization meeting, which for most of you is probably coming up in the next couple of weeks, adopt board protocols and identify who will be your board spokesperson. It is typically the chair, but it's not mandated that it be the chair. And that's the person that you direct all inquiries to. So if you get a call from the local newspaper and they want to talk to you about something that went down at the board meeting, you're going to say, I'm sorry, but you really need to speak to my chair. He or she is the spokesperson for our board. And that way people who are unhappy with the outcome of how a vote went, perhaps, are taken out of the position of having to both defend the board's action as the vote of the majority and also have to explain their own vote against whatever the particular item might have been. A lot of times the media want to churn that up because it helps sell papers, and because they think that's that kind of gossip is what keeps our small towns going. But really, you want to focus on the business at hand and how the public engages with that business. Smart to have one person be that voice. The VSBA also has, and we are also going to distribute, a recommended code of ethics that we really recommend every board member sign at the beginning of each term. So if you're elected to your 4th 3-year term, you sign it again. Or some boards actually have every board member sign it every single year at the reorganization meeting. And highlights of that document include this one voice principle and clarity around the relationship between board members and district employees so that everybody's on the same page. And that's really important so that you can focus on the work and not have to be in the mud with board dynamics. And also there's a fiduciary responsibility that comes along with the job, and the code of ethics spells that out pretty cleanly. And it relates to the required conflict of interest policy, which most boards have already adopted. It's required by state statute. The VSBA model policy is clear about both actual and perceived conflicts of interest. And these policies are really, really important, especially in our smaller towns where everybody knows everybody, or sometimes everybody feels like they know everybody, or you know of people's actions even though you may not know them, or you have relatives working in the school district. In a small town, sometimes it's really, really hard to stay in your lane as a board member. And so even if it's a perceived conflict of interest, do your board a favor, do your school district a favor, and just recuse yourself from that particular discussion item. So if your, sister's ex-husband's cousin is bidding on a contract for the school district, you got 4 or 12 other board members who can make that decision, and take yourself out of it. It's best for the board that way. It maintains credibility for you as an individual. It maintains credibility for the board. Just know what those limits are. Questions about those kinds of board dynamics that sort of happen outside of the actual board's work?
I have a few questions here for you.
Okay.
One says, this goes back to the last section.
Sure.
Hold on. If the board chooses to not permit public comments during the discussion of an agenda item, how is the public able to be heard by the board pertaining to a decision the board will be making? If the public comment is at the end of the meeting, the board isn't able to take into consideration the voice of the community prior to voting.
Well, you will have taken that into account at your previous meeting when that was a discussion item.
And also many boards will, from what I've seen recently, a lot of boards are providing public comment at the beginning and the end of the meeting to cover that that possibility, to make sure that people have a chance to speak to things that are on the agenda that evening, but then also at the end of the meeting to have a chance for the public to provide comment then as well.
So you're saying it's usually a good idea to have it on the agenda at one board meeting for discussion and then vote on it at the next board meeting?
Or at a future board meeting, yes.
Okay. Is it proper protocol with regard to speaking as one voice to allow individual board members to hold forums in their local town for a unified board, to take information but not to speak for the board?
Sue, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Sure. Can you read it again, Carrie, please?
Sure. Is it proper protocol with regard to speaking as one voice to allow individual board members to hold forums in their local town for a unified board, to take information but not to speak for the board?
I think that would be fine as long as they're, as the questioner says, they're not speaking for the board. And I don't know if I would call it a forum, but it would just be an opportunity for people to provide input, on a specific question. I think that I'm remembering, Susan, a board that had a Nellie Mae grant on community engagement, and they did something sort of similar to what this is talking about, like meeting people at the dump and stuff like that.
Right.
So I think that's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah, as long as it's not a quorum of the board, then it
Right.
becomes, then it becomes a different issue.
Yes.
Yeah, it has to be warned, right?
Yes.
Okay, so this is an interesting question. Each year, we ask all board members to sign the code of ethics. Some refuse to sign, and they encourage others to refuse under the guise of it's quote unquote, it's covered in policy. Should the chair insist? Since we are meeting virtually, can the board motion to, oh, it just cut off. Since we're meeting, can the board motion to adopt the code of ethics as a whole?
Yes, the board can motion to adopt the code of ethics as a whole, and that really addresses the issue of if there's resistance by a board member to signing it, the board can do that.
Another thing that I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, another thing that I've seen, which I think is sort of interesting, is that some districts, some boards take those signed documents and post PDFs on the website. And so if a board member or two have not signed them, there's a fairly noticeable gap there. And I think that's sort of like when the small town newspapers publish the tax delinquency lists. There's a little bit of it just brings to light the fact that people chose not to sign it. And that, for me, that raises questions.
Another thing that I can add is that in our Essential Work of School Boards book, the sample code of ethics is in there. It's also on VSBA's website. And one of the reasons that it is an important document is it ensures consistency with if everybody has the same expectations. And one way to ensure that consistency is to adopt the code of ethics and also a process for addressing any board misconduct that involves not complying with that code of ethics. And in relation to that, there is a sample process in the Essential Work of School Boards book for addressing any board misconduct that involves not complying with the code of ethics that's been adopted by the board.
Okay, one last question. Board members represent their own town. If a community member has a concern or wishes to have an item on the agenda for a future meeting, how do I do that without violating policy by discussing board business? I'm confused by what they mean.
Yeah, I think this question is asking if they're discussing board business by speaking with a member of the public that they represent. They can individually do that. So I'm not quite sure. I don't quite understand the question.
So I think what a quorum of the board discussing board business is what needs to be warned, not discussing it with the public. Is that, I think that kind of answers what they're saying.
Right. It's yeah. If it's a board member individually, that's not a quorum of the board. So that's not a board
Right.
meeting.
So board members can talk to each other. They just can't have a quorum of the board discussing anything without it being warned.
Correct. One board member can speak to another board member, but you know, sometimes it's you've got a 3-member board, so you've got to be careful about that as well.
Right.
That was our last question.
Okay. So, what governs board meetings? Which laws are we really needing to be mindful of as we go through? There's been some question recently about Robert's Rules of Order, and I just want to be clear that the Vermont statutes define Robert's Rules of Order as being the process to govern the conduct of school board meetings, period. There is a version of Robert's Rules for small boards, if you have fewer than 12 people, that are a little bit less formal and can be adopted by the board by vote at an organizational meeting. But it is still Robert's Rules, and the process is still the same. Motions, however, don't need to be seconded, and the board chair gets to vote. And there are a couple of other notable distinctions, and there's a comparison of those also in the Essential Work of Vermont School Boards book that Sue referenced earlier. And then we have our favorite topic, open meeting law. So compliance with open meeting law is the responsibility of every public body, and a school board is a public body. Whether you're a district board or an SU board. So it's the responsibility of all board members to understand the law and comply with it. The purpose of the law is transparency. We are public officers elected to these seats by voters. And as such, they are entitled to know what we're doing and how we're spending their money. And so that is really at the heart of the open meeting law. And I think people understand that, but there are times where it does feel a little bit cumbersome and restrictive. And that is true, but that is the law. This is very abbreviated in this presentation today because we wanted to make sure we got through a lot of other topics of conversation. But in case you missed it, we did do a webinar on open meeting law with a guest from the Secretary of State's office about a year ago, a little less, and it is in the archives. And if you have questions about open meeting law, I direct you to take a look at that either by watching the video or just looking at the slide deck. It's pretty comprehensive, and it does go into some of the nuances that we're going to bypass today. But the law says that anytime a quorum, that's more than half, holds a meeting, and then it goes on to define meeting. A quorum is a majority of the entire public body. So if you are, as Sue mentioned earlier, if there are 3 people on your board, 2 is a quorum. If there are 12 people on your board, 7 is a quorum. And of course, you can't have a meeting without a quorum. But if you have a quorum, it is a meeting. And a meeting is a gathering of a quorum of the public body for the purpose of discussing business or taking action. It leads back to our conversation about what's on the agenda. So there are rules about warning that meeting and where you post it and how many days warning you must provide, and that's all built into the law. What does conducting business of the public body mean? Well, governmental functions, including any matter over which the public body has supervision, control, jurisdiction, or advisory power. So that's basically all of the work of a school board. A meeting can take place in any physical location, so work sessions and retreats are meetings, and they can happen over a span of time. It's not that you all must be congregated in one space at one time. And so things like email strings and social media discussions are on the edge of open meeting law. And you need to be really, really careful when attempting to discuss board business other than at the board table, because really good chance that you are violating open meeting law. So group emails are to be avoided except for scheduling a meeting, creating an agenda, or distributing materials that will be discussed, a board packet, let's say. But never okay to actually discuss a board item, an agenda item, or board business. And one of the ways to really prime yourself on this as a board member, if your chair or your central office sends you your board packet and you have questions, instead of replying all, where you then have a quorum of the board, direct your question to the specific person, whether it's the superintendent or the board chair or a particular individual. One-on-one is much safer in terms of open meeting law than the group. We've had boards ask about, especially during the pandemic, about, or committees ask about working documents, say in Google Docs, where they can co-author something collaboratively. That's a problem. It runs the risk of a quorum conducting board business outside of a Warren meeting because you are advancing a topic on the agenda. And then executive session is sort of a byproduct of the open meeting law. There are certain issues that can be discussed away from the public, but they are very, very specific. So there are 14 statutory categories that provide exceptions, allow you to go into executive session. The body has to be really clear why you're going into executive session. You need to vote to go into executive. First, you need to vote to determine that the exception, one of those 14 statutory categories, is in fact the situation, and then a motion to enter into executive session. And if there's any question whether a topic, you know, you want to slap an employee on the wrist, figuratively, of course, not physically, or there are questions that just are too hard to talk about in the public eye, check with your attorney to make sure that there is an appropriate provision of the executive session rules that applies. Otherwise, you really are bound to stay in open session.
Can I add something here, Susan?
Absolutely.
Thanks. So I just wanted to once again let people know about the open meeting law webinar that we did. I believe it was last May, and we had the Deputy Secretary of State, Chris Winters, as our guest presenter, and it covers executive session in quite a bit of detail. So if you, it's a good reference to have going forward. Thanks.
Thank you. Right, and then once in executive session, there are some parameters to consider. So only the subject for which the body identified the need for executive session in a motion in open session can be discussed in the executive session. And the board can decide who you want to invite into executive session. So maybe your administration, maybe your legal counsel, somebody who's the subject of discussion. All of those people may attend if you invite them, and only if you invite them. Minutes are not required in executive session, and we recommend that you don't take minutes in executive session, because if you do, they become part of the public record. And the whole point of having executive session is to be able to have that conversation off the public record. No action is to be taken in executive session, with a couple of really very specific exceptions. So otherwise, you need to adjourn your executive session, return to your open session, and then have a motion for a vote on whatever it was that was just discussed. And you're not required to go into executive session, but you do have that tool when appropriate. Now, there were temporary modifications made to some of the open meeting law and executive session requirements with the governor's state of emergency that are still in effect. And we do have a video, which is referenced here, that just outlines what those are. Probably the most notable one is that a virtual meeting that's properly warned is acceptable. Nobody needs to be in a physical location. That virtual meetings must, however, be recorded if at all possible, and there must be a way for the public to attend. So we've all covered that, and now most of the platforms that are available for video conferencing are also providing a phone call-in option so that people can attend the meeting even if they're not participating with broadband. So a couple of things to remember, and this goes back to the public comment discussions that we were having before. Board meetings are public meetings, but they are not meetings of the public. And that relates to what we were talking about before about public comment for each agenda item separately, rather than having them all lumped together. If you have an opportunity for the public to chime in on every agenda item, it becomes a meeting of the public. And that's a problem, because you've got an agenda and you've got work to do, and you need to get through your work as a board. The public has elected you to make those decisions. And while you certainly want and must have an opportunity for them to express themselves, that's not a prolonged discussion. They can stand up and make their statement, and the board listens. You don't respond to that. You don't engage in that. And you certainly don't take time away from today's meeting to get involved in a item that was not intended for discussion. And so here's the public comment legal language that Sue was referencing earlier. And I just want to, the bottom bullet point there, subject to reasonable rules established by the chair. The chair needs to make sure that the public feels welcome at the meetings, but also has to make sure it's a balancing act, right? You need to make sure that you're staying focused. So you should have a public comment policy in your policy manual anyway. And the rules of public comment are, if they're in the policy, then it's not disputed. But the chair can set rules for, as we talked about earlier, a meeting where there's a really hot topic and you have a lot of people want to talk on it, whether it's limiting time and or limiting the number of times an individual can speak. There are ways to control the amount of time that public comment takes, but probably the best way to control it is to not react, because that's really going to divert your attention away from where the board's work is for, as laid out in the agenda. And that brings us to minutes. So the minimum content of the minutes are that you have to identify the members who are present, the So the board members who are present, active participants might be your staff, might be invited guests, might be teachers who are providing you with a presentation on something. All motions and proposals and resolutions and their dispositions, including who made those motions and who seconded them and what the outcome of those votes were. And if there is a roll call, the individual votes need to be included in the minutes. And then those minutes must be posted for inspection and copying upon request wherever your board protocols identify as the locations for your board communications. That would include the warnings, and particularly posted to your school district website if you have one, or a designated website that you use. And they need to be available for at least a year so that anybody who wants to create a history of a particular item can research that through the minutes. Draft minutes may be replaced with updated and approved minutes once they have been voted on. Okay, that brings us to more questions on, I know we did get into public comment period and a little bit into open meeting law earlier, but here's another chance.
Okay. The first few questions came via email prior to the webinar. First question is, I'd love to get some effective strategies on how to handle public comment, especially with a full warned agenda. Is there always a time limit to public comment?
There's not always a time limit, but again, if you're keeping a timed agenda, that would create a protocol for that based on your practices. And if there is an expectation, I said this earlier, if there's an expectation of a long public comment period because there are a lot of people who want to contribute, it may be best to have that as a separate meeting. And call it a public forum, or call it a discussion, or call it a work session, and invite the public to come and participate.
Okay, who keeps the time?
The board is responsible for enforcing its own policies. So if you have a policy that allows the chair to establish a time, a board member needs to be the timekeeper or a designee.
Okay.
And the only thing I would add is you don't have to have a policy to allow the chair to do that, because the open meeting law says that the chair is responsible to make reasonable rules for public comment. For public comment. So the chair may be running the meeting, and they might ask another board member to keep the time, or if there's someone there assisting the board, they could keep the time. There's no particular rule about who keeps the time.
Okay, how do boards respond to the public and even some board members who don't follow the open meeting laws?
I think that the process that's in the essential work of Vermont school boards, having to do with procedures for addressing board member conduct that is not in compliance with the code of ethics, that lays out a very straightforward process for doing that. I can just give you sort of a summary of what it is. It's a sample process for addressing board member misconduct, and says that it will be considered misconduct for a member of the board to fail to adhere to the expectations agreed to by the board, or to engage in conduct that is otherwise injurious to the district. And there are fines for violating the open meeting law. So I think that this could fall within injurious to the district, even if the board hadn't discussed its expectations about open meeting law. But then it lays out a sample process, which involves the board chair, as long as the situation doesn't involve the board chair, to document and give written notice of the alleged misconduct to the board member. And then after 3 documented instances of alleged misconduct or 1 serious instance, the board chair would meet to review the conduct with the board member, and the board member who's the subject of the allegations will be given a chance to review the documentation of the alleged misconduct and to meet with the board chair or a committee of the board to respond to the allegations. And discussion of a board member's performance is a permissible subject for discussion in executive session under Vermont open meeting law. But if they're going to take any action to censure or issue a formal request for resignation, that would have to occur in open session. After the meeting about the alleged misconduct, the board chair can recommend 1 or more of the following actions to the full board for its action. And this is just a sample process, so you could make your own process, but this process says the actions that the board chair could possibly recommend would be, first of all, a board level discussion of the misconduct, including a possible vote of censure against the person in question. Second would be communication of the misconduct to the community represented by the board member. Third would be a formal request for that person's resignation from the board. And we recommend strongly that before taking any of the above actions, that a board should consult with its own attorney to ensure that that they're conducting this process legally and that the wording of any proposed motion does not create any legal issues for the district.
I think it's really important to remember too that this is a law and there is a financial consequence if, after all channels are followed, if it's determined that the public body violated the law. So, you know, this is a pretty fundamental aspect of the behavior of the public body.
Yes, that's a good point, Susan. And also beyond the financial consequences in the open meeting law itself, there would also be financial consequences for the board having to incur attorney's fees, most likely.
Right.
So one more thing I want to clarify, Sue, is that they can request a resignation, but they can't require a resignation, correct?
Right.
Correct.
Yes.
Okay, we have, I think, one more question that was and then we have a whole bunch more that have just been made. How much wiggle room do we have with open meeting laws?
That's easy. None.
Okay, that was an easy question. All right, now, as to ones people just asked, what is the statutory section for the open meeting law? Thank you. A pickup basketball game is not a meeting, for instance. If 3/5 of your board is there, only if they're discussing board agenda items, correct, or board work. If there's a majority of the board there, correct? At a basketball game.
Right, at a basketball game, yes. So
Yes.
open meeting law, the statutory citation, it begins at 1 Vermont Statutes Annotated, which we call VSA, section 310. And that has the definitions. That's an important section. And it goes all the way through section 314, which is the penalty and enforcement section. And meeting is specifically defined in the open meeting law in the definition section. Gathering of a quorum of the members of a public body for the purpose of discussing the business of the public body or for the purpose of taking action. So, you know, if you're at a basketball game or playing in a basketball game together, 3 board members out of a 5-member board, but there is no discussion of the business of the board, that's not a meeting under the open meeting law. There's also this is a little bit unusual. Usually definition sections don't say what something isn't. They just say, you know, they just have a definition of meeting. But in the open meeting law, the definition section also has a section about meeting shall not mean. And there's several different things that are laid out about what a meeting is not. So under section 3C, says meetings shall not mean occasions when a quorum of a public body attends social gatherings, conventions, conferences, training programs, press conferences, media events, or otherwise gathers, provided that the public body does not discuss specific business of the public body. That at the time of the exchange, the participating members expect to be business of the public body at a later time. So I think that.
So a lot of people ask, I'm sorry.
Go
So
ahead.
a lot of people ask us that question when it comes to our annual conference, if a majority of the board can come, and you're not discussing your board's business, just school board business in general. So that's not, doesn't have to be a warned meeting.
Correct.
Okay. What is the site for the exceptions executive session? Thank you. I think that's what you just gave. Is that correct?
Executive session is 1 VSA section 313.
Thank you. Oops. All right. It sounds like minutes can be taken, but are kept confidential. But at least a record is kept. I'm thinking they mean minutes of the executive session. I think any minutes taken are public, right?
Correct. So if you don't want a public record of your executive session, don't take minutes.
And I did see in your list of necessities for the minutes, I didn't see a general public person who comes but does not speak, does not participate. Do they need, is that a requirement that the list of guests in the audience are on the minutes? I didn't see that on there.
I'm not sure if that's a requirement or just best practice. Sue, do you know?
I was looking for the statutory citation. I am not sure if that's a requirement. I think your slide had the everything that was required under the law
Okay.
per minute.
Good to know. Many boards vote to come out of executive session. Is that required?
Sorry, I was looking for the minutes, the answer to the minutes question. Many boards vote to come out of its executive session.
Exactly, yes.
Question? Okay.
Yes.
So they shouldn't be voting in executive session. Any votes, the only votes that are allowed in executive session are for real estate options. So they can come out of executive session and then vote on the whatever they were in executive session about. But most typically a board would just, the chair would close the executive session.
Yeah, they declare us out of executive session.
If you do not have a quorum of the board members, you can't have a meeting, correct? That's a question. Or can you have the meeting, but nothing can be voted on until there is a quorum?
It's not a meeting until you have a quorum.
So you can't open the meeting until you have a quorum, correct?
Yes.
All right. There has to be a discussion to determine if the meeting will go into executive session, and then a motion to put that item into executive session, and then another motion to enter executive session. Is that correct?
There is, I would refer you to the open meeting law webinar that we did in May of 2020. There is a, and why don't we do this? When we send out the materials for this, we could send the PowerPoint for that webinar.
Right,
it has,
I can link to the, I'm sorry, I can link to the video and the PowerPoint.
okay,
Great.
that would be great because it specifically sets out how to go into executive session as far as motions go, and I think it's got helpful language in it.
Great. All right. Due to COVID, is the amount of time to post the draft minutes longer than 5 days?
Just a moment, I'm going to pull up that. Yes, but it's very limited. It's in the event of a staffing shortage during the declared state of emergency, a school board may extend the time limit for posting of minutes to not more than 10 days from the date of the meeting. But you'd have to actually have a staffing shortage, and you'd have to have the board extend the time limit. So it's not just automatically giving you more time.
And the next one is also about minutes. It says draft minutes replaced by approved minutes on the website. Is that required?
They should be replaced by the approved minutes so that the approved minutes are on there. Yes.
Is it common to have an attendance policy for board members? We have a board member who doesn't regularly attend, is often late and or does not participate. I don't know what the policy could say because you can't kick someone off a board. So
There may be something in the, I'm not sure if there's something in the code of ethics regarding attendance, but a board could certainly set an expectation about attendance. And then if that expectation, it would need to be reflected in a written document. And then if that expectation was not, if a board member did not meet that expectation, they could certainly have the discussion with the board member under the draft or the proposed procedures for addressing board member conduct.
all right. Once a meeting has been called to order, can the chairperson designate an independent facilitator to run the meeting, whether or not the facilitator is a member of the board? That's an interesting question. So they're saying the
It's not clear to
chairperson,
me. Is it a regular board meeting?
once a meeting has been called to order, so they're saying they want someone else to be designated as the chair, even though they're not a board member? Designated by the chairperson? That seems odd.
The
Yeah.
chair may, if there's a discussion item that, I don't know, some technology consultant is coming in to talk to the board about the investment they're going to make or whatever, the chair may turn that item over to an outside person, but I can't envision turning the whole meeting over.
Right. Because the person's not a board member, so they can't run the board meeting, I would think.
Right.
Yes, I would agree with that.
I think we've reached the end of the questions.
Perfect, because Sue just texted me that she has to leave.
Well, yeah, we're at 10 after 1, so.
That was really. So if you do have any additional questions, just send them along, either by phone or text or email, and we'll make sure to get you answers, and we'll send them out to others who are also on the call. Thank you all very much for attending, and I guess maybe I'm a little bit inspired by town meeting day and the success of education issues that went along with that in this very weird year. So thank you again for the commitment that you make to the children of your community and our state. Please do take a moment when you sign off of the webinar to complete the evaluation, and don't ever hesitate to get in touch with any one of us. We are here for you. Thank you so much.
Bye.